adjunct. I'm an adjunct professor at the School of Professional Studies. I'm also a coach and a consultant. I spent more than 35 years. My expertise is in leadership, communication, and people management through many years of having learned by trial and error, how to do that. And so I want to talk with you today just about, how to best advocate for yourself so that you get the most out of your career. At the end of the session, I'll be opening up the floor to questions. So before we get started, just a few points about the chat box. Let's just take a moment, and if everyone could just introduce yourself, just your name and where you're from, so that we can all get to know each other a little bit in this virtual forum. And make sure that when you're chatting that you're set to everyone, otherwise you might be just typing to individual members. Hi, Ashley, thank you and welcome. Okay, so I'm just going to give you all another 30 seconds. Hi, Alice. Yifei, welcome. Awesome. Yeah, and please continue to do that. It's so nice to still have some connection with people, even though everything has become virtual. And I want you to answer just one question for me today. If this was going to be the best hour that we spent together, what would you like to get out of this conversation? Very good, Ashley. Yes, that's a very good point. Good. Okay. Well, let's get started. And so we've got, we're actually now. Let's take a look. Let's start with more confidence. Oh, good. How to speak up. Excellent. Yes. And I'm going to talk about all of these things. But let's first start with focusing on, and Tiffany, we're going to go to the next slide now. Let's focus on a couple of things before we start talking about how to advocate for ourselves. It's important to understand the what is of the situation. Despite women's presence in the workforce for so many decades now, women are still paid less than their male counterparts. And many organizations realize that this will have to change. And the organizations that get this right will have a competitive advantage, as they will have greater employee satisfaction and engagement, and also higher levels of innovation. Now, before we can change this, we have to understand some basic fundamental truths. And the first truth is that men and women process information differently. So why am I sharing this? Well, because I think it's important that we first acknowledge the elephant in the room. And before we can dive into the things that we can do to better advocate for yourself, then we have to acknowledge that there is some unfairness and some systemic bias in the system. And that leaders at all levels in organization will have to work on those biases in order to really affect change. Now, I'm only acknowledging that this is the what is. I'm not blaming anyone for it, and I'm not complaining about it. But I think we first have to understand the backdrop of, what we're dealing with. And there are many key differences. Like, for example, men and women's brains process information very differently. Men use much more gray matter, while women use much more white matter. And those differences, like for example, the gray matter allows you to stay focused and, dealing with one process at a time. It's very, very laser sharp focus. Whereas white matter is more of the networking grid that allows you to connect different centers of the brain so that you can make quick transitions, you can, see connections between things that appear different on the surface. And it also makes women much more able to read nonverbal cues. Another key difference between men and women's brains is that the anterior cortex of women is much larger. Now, the anterior cortex is the part of the brain that controls emotions and memories. So this actually explains why women are much better at remembering the details of that argument long after a man has forgotten. But because of these differences, men and women not only communicate differently, but women have a greater difficulty communicating what they intuitively know to be true. And so, it's understanding these key differences between men and women that'll really help us to understand how to better advocate for ourselves. When we think about listening versus, listening to diagnose versus listening to solve problems, there are another key area of differences between men and women. Men tend to listen only with the left side of the brain being active. So they're always listening for action, what's the point? Whereas women tend to be more people-oriented and will listen with both sides of the brain. So that makes them less action-oriented, but they want to hear more about the context and, the journey of how, decisions are made. And so you can imagine that if a man is in a conversation listening for the point, and a woman is giving the context and background, it can be very frustrating in those situations. So has anyone encountered some, have you come across some of these kinds of differences between men and women? Here's another key difference. A woman will sit and listen to a speaker, and when a woman is listening, she will often nod her head. The nodding of the head doesn't signify that she agrees. It basically signifies that she's listening and she hears you, and yes, she's following the conversation. A man will only nod his head when he is actually agreeing. So you can see that if you're the person assuming that nodding means consent, that, it's not necessarily true. So you really do have to work and check in with each other to figure out really what's being said. And it's funny because now that we are doing more video calls, I'm actually watching the images of people. And I noticed yesterday in a meeting that, the women in general were nodding their heads, and the men were perfectly still. And I found myself just looking at that going, wow, it's true. Like, I don't know if they agree or don't agree. And I can't assume that the women are in agreement, like they're just listening. And so I kept looking now for the cues that a man was listening as to whether or not his head moved. And it's interesting because it really is something like to become aware of in your environment. Men and women work in the workplace the way that they used to play when they were on the playground. So this is another key area between how boys and girls are treated differently from the start and how they're socialized. Parents tend to talk more to girl babies than to boys, and they tend to overestimate their boys' physical abilities while overestimating their girls' verbal abilities. And, I remember being in school and where school teachers would allow boys to constantly shout out answers, but often when the girls did it, it was like, oh, okay, raise your hand, or it wasn't tolerated as much. So understanding how the socialization is different helps you understand how they, compete at work. So if you go back to the playground, girls would jump rope or, some activity like that. But the way that girls played was they cooperated. They would take turns, you know, as to who would jump and who would turn the ropes. Everyone had a chance to play, and it was a pretty supportive environment. Whereas boys on the other side of the playground were probably playing basketball or some other competitive sport. Only the best player got the ball, right? They kept score. And, you know, and of course, you know, I know that I'm generalizing a little bit, because I know some girls play basketball and some boys play jump rope, you know, that's okay. But the idea is really understanding how, you know, how we each have, you know, evolved, how we're socialized, that this all impacts how we show up in the workplace. So in general, girls will want to avoid losing while boys want to win, right? A girl strives for perfection in their play, whereas a boy is just thrilled to be the best player on the court for that one day. So what does this tell us about women's leadership and being an advocate for yourself? Well, number one, it means that you have to let go of perfection. And let me give you an example, and maybe this will resonate with you. When a woman is looking at a job posting for a new role that she might be interested in, she will not apply unless she has more than 90% of the qualifications. And this was a study that was done, and it's very interesting. Men, on the other hand, will apply if they can see that they meet at least 30% of the qualifications. And so that's a very big difference. That idea that, you know, a woman has about, you know, being perfect and having to meet 100% of the requirements. It's okay to let that grow and to let that go. And don't be afraid to throw your hat in the ring, even if you can't tick off all the boxes. No one's a perfect match. And if you don't try, you'll never know what can happen. Okay, so let me just pause for a moment. We've talked about a few of the, and after we go through the basic differences, then we'll the next slide will talk about some tips to really, you know, activate and help you become more powerful as an advocate. But let me stop and check in with you and see if you have any questions in the moment. Feel free to use the chat. You know, let me know, like, is this making sense? Have you had some of these experiences? Okay, well, I'll keep an eye on the chat box. Feel welcome just to jump in and, you know, provide some feedback. Another basic difference between men and women is that we can be using the same words, but we have very different definitions. And there's lots of reasons for this. There's actually a really great book by Barbara Annis, which is called Same Words, Different Language. She conducted research with thousands of participants over 3 decades. And she found that there were some very, very clear differences between men and women. And here are just some of the highlights. Women are more likely to look for areas of agreement and conversation, whereas men are more likely to look for the gaps. And so see if that holds true in the environments that you're in. Another thing that she noticed was that women are more likely to switch topics during conversation, where men are more likely to deal with one topic at a time. So as we talked about earlier, because of the differences between how our brains are structured, and that men use more gray matter and women use more white matter, you know, that connectivity that women have in using the white matter allows them to more easily move around in topics versus dealing with one at a time. There was a book a couple of decades ago written by John Gray called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And he talked about a time when he found himself in a circle of female friends, and that, you know, they seemed to be switching from topic to topic, and that, you know, eventually all the topics would get covered, but you know, he said his brain was going to explode because, you know, they kept jumping around and could follow each other, and he was completely lost. So that was always kind of a funny anecdote of how that communication happens. Another thing that Barbara wrote about in her book was that women are more likely to share problems just when they want to talk about them, whereas men only tend to share problems when they're looking for help in fixing them. So if you begin to recognize some of these basic differences between how men and women communicate, it really helps to avoid misunderstandings. So as the sender of information, you have to clarify what your intention is. So if I'm approaching a male colleague and I want to talk about a problem I'm having, I can preface it by saying, Bob, I have this problem. I'd like someone to talk to about it. Do you think you'd be willing to listen without, you know, without trying to solve it? I just need to hear my thoughts out loud. And the same thing, if you're the receiver of the information, you can go ahead and ask some clarifying questions. So Mary, I hear you talking about this problem. What role would you like me to play for you? Do you need help solving it, or do you just need me to listen? So, you know, use some of these ideas as you think about your interactions that you have with people of the opposite sex. I do want to say also that gender is very fluid, right? So there are many men on the planet who have much more, like more white matter and that network ability, you know, that have more feminine aspects that are activated. And there are also many women that have more, you know, masculine attributes who use more gray matter. There's no black and white. You have to really check in with the person that you're talking to and figure out, what they need in order to have the communication go well. Okay, so we're going to move now to the next slide, and I want to dive in with some really concrete steps that you can take in order to better advocate for yourself. And these steps are not just for women, but they're really best practices for anyone who wants to have, greater communication and also to achieve the career success that you're looking for. Okay, so tip number one, make sure that you're choosing roles that showcase your particular skills. Now, most teams and organizations will have lots of projects. Some of those projects are headliners that get a lot of attention, while others tend to be more mundane, the kind of housekeeping sort of tasks that hardly get notice. And believe it or not, women are more likely, or at least, traditionally in the past, I think this is changing and I think the changes are positive, but still many women are more likely to work in mundane areas. And so as much as possible, you want to avoid falling into that trap. Instead, before you're coming into a meeting where people are going to be talking about roles and parts to play, first think about what you're good at. And think about the kind of skills that you want to develop. So this comes into, you may not have 90% of what's required, but maybe you want to start to develop, greater communication skills, or maybe you want to learn particular skills in relationship to, specific like logic or, anything that can help you grow and develop. The idea is that when you select a project, you want to maximize both of those areas. You want to be able to pick something that showcases some of what you're good at, but also stretches you a bit in order to develop something that maybe you haven't tried before. So always plan ahead before going into a meeting and think about the kind of work you want to do in this way when people are asking you to volunteers so that you can pursue some of the more higher value interests. So if you're among the first to raise your hand, then you won't have to worry about being, stuck with whatever options no one else wants. You don't want to be associated with taking the team's leftover assignments. Of course, it's not a big deal if this happens once in a while. We've all had to endure something in our careers that wasn't the best fit. But if that's the kind of assignment you take over and over again, your team will view you as less valuable. And if you're asked to do grunt work or office chores, you can also politely decline. Um, it's also okay to say, well, maybe there's some way where we can pass this work around so that everyone gets a turn. It's just important that you're an active participant. Please don't ever leave the room before someone assigns you to something to avoid having a direct conversation, because this is just passive aggressive behavior. Once you've earned that seat at the table, stay and enjoy it. And if you're constantly doing the office work or the work nobody wants to do, you won't be perceived as competent. So make sure that you're being deliberate in picking the roles that really showcase your expertise. Okay, let's move on to tip number 2. This is one of my favorites. Overcoming imposter syndrome. I'm an experienced executive with a bachelor's degree in computer science, 3 master's degrees, and a doctorate, and I suffer from imposter syndrome. Believe it or not, I'm not alone. More than 70% of women have it, and many men feel the same way. And so, what is it? Well, when you have it, it's hard to accept praise. You start to believe that maybe you're not qualified, or maybe you're not smart enough, or not capable enough, and that soon everyone will find you out as an imposter. In many ways, you start to think that your success has just been due to luck. So it keeps you from trying new things, and it can steal away your confidence. Well, here are some ways that if you think you might have imposter syndrome, you can start to work on it. First of all, the first thing you can do is really recognizing your feeling. If you try to ignore the voice within, it only gets louder. And so one of the ways you can recognize your feelings is to talk about it. Of course, this feels scary and vulnerable, so make sure you talk to someone who's a trusted friend or mentor and who can remind you of your talent, and they can help you see that you deserve the promotion or the accolades. And chances are that the person you're talking to has experienced imposter syndrome themselves. And so, you're also helping them. Another effective tool that you can use is just reframing your thoughts. So for example, let's say you have an exam coming, and if you're thinking, oh, I will fail this exam, well, force yourself to change the language to something, that you can believe, like, I will perform my very best and I will do well. So rather, for myself, rather than me thinking, oh gosh, I shouldn't be doing this presentation because I don't have much to say, instead I can think, I have a unique perspective to share with people who may be having the same experiences that I have, and we can learn from each other. So changing the dialogue in your head is a very good step toward approaching new things more positively. There was a great book that I read, probably could be 15, 20 years ago. The book was called Feeling Good. I'm sure you can buy it on Amazon. They probably have them in their used book area. But Feeling Good was written by Dr. David Burns, who is known as one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy. And in the book, he takes you through a process of examining what your thoughts are and then helping you to reframe the dialogue so that instead of getting caught in a negative thought loop, you're looking at the more positive aspects and helping yourself change the dialogue in your own mind about who you are and the value that you bring. Another thing that I like to do is I like to collect all the positive experiences, and I keep like what I would call like a virtual scrapbook in my mind. where I've collected compliments and awards and accolades and promotions. And if I'm being, if I'm being pulled into a state of doubt about myself, I'll pull out this virtual scrapbook and just look through and, hear the voices of the people who were giving me positive reinforcement. And then, of course, if your feelings are very deeply rooted and you're finding it's hard to manage and that your negative thoughts about yourself are too strong, you might consider seeking a professional help. While imposter syndrome is not a mental health issue, so many who suffer from it can also have anxiety and depression, which is very treatable. So don't be afraid to reach out and get the help that you need. Okay, good. Now, the third tip has to do with managing your anger and stress at work. Showing emotions at work, it's not a bad thing. Leaders that are able to show how they feel seem more genuine and approachable, and it's important for empathy. I like to listen to Brene Brown, who's a researcher and has done some wonderful TED Talks on vulnerability. The problem isn't showing emotions at work. The problem becomes when emotions are out of control, because this can really hurt your career. People who can't control emotions often can't receive feedback and they become very defensive. And so no one really wants to ride on an emotional roller coaster with you. So if you have issues with that, really work on controlling your anger. There's a myth that says women are more emotional than men, and it's really not true. Both genders feel the same emotions, and neither one is better at managing them. However, we do express them very differently. For example, women have the hormone prolactin, and it's found in a high percentage in our tears. And so that's why when a woman gets emotional, she is more likely or apt to cry. Men are socialized to be more comfortable with loud noises, so they may yell when they're emotional. So we have different ways of expressing it. Another key difference is that the prefrontal cortex, which controls rational thought, while the emotional center is controlled by the amygdala, your brain is in a constant state of fighting between the logic centers, the rational centers of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And so when emotions take over, that means that the amygdala has won the fight. And there's actually a term for this called amygdala hijacking. Once a person is in that state, the body secretes a high number of stress hormones, including cortisol. And there's actually a difference between how quickly men and women can reabsorb this excess cortisol. It may have something to do possibly with muscle mass. I'm not really sure why. However, men can reabsorb the excess cortisol that their body releases in about 2 to 4 hours. Whereas for a woman, it can take anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. So in order to really keep emotions in check, you have to find ways to let the prefrontal cortex win. So here are 3 tips. The first thing you can do is just tune into your breath. So as you're sitting there, sit up straight with both feet on the floor and just take a few deep breaths. Just inhaling and exhaling, because this will help to slow down your heart rate, and it also helps to counteract the stress response. So just go ahead and take a few easy breaths and just see how differently your body feels after you do that. Just inhale and exhale. Okay, so that's the first step. Focus on your breath. It helps to slow you down and help you relax. The second thing is to just name the emotion to yourself. You can try thinking, I'm angry, or I'm frustrated. And once you name it, it actually brings more of the attention back to the prefrontal cortex. So that allows the amygdala and prefrontal cortex to start to work better together. And that also will calm you down. The final tip that I have for you, and this is my favorite and the one that I really suggest you implement it, is to take a break from the heated situation. So what I would always do is carry a half-empty water bottle with me to a meeting. And whenever I would start to feel stressed, I would finish the water and excuse myself to go get a refill. And just taking that moment to step away, walk to the water fountain, refill, really gave me time to step away from the situation and to be able to come back with it with some clarity. So tip number 3 is manage your own emotional reactions so that you're better connected with yourself, which will help you better connect with other people. Okay, tip number 4. And this involves getting good feedback for yourself as a female. Getting constructive feedback is really important for advancing anyone's career. And did you know that even though men and women experience the same performance challenges, they often get very different kinds of feedback from supervisors? Whereas men are reported to get more substantive, actionable feedback, women often get more stylistic feedback. A long time ago, I once asked a manager what I could do to improve my performance. And the response I got was, well, maybe smile a bit more. And when you meet with your customers, you should really wear lipstick. Now, I know that sounds funny in this day and age, but really, it's not uncommon. But I think people are getting better about it. But really, what I realized is that I had to ask a better question. So rather than just asking a very general, "What can I do to improve?" I started asking questions that related more to what competency do I need to work on in order to get to the next level? Or, another tip that I use would be to bring a copy of a job description for the next higher role that I was interested in. And I would say, well, here are the competencies that are important in this next role. Which one of these do you think I need to work on the most? And can you give me advice on how you maybe overcame some of your challenges? So if you're asking more specific questions, then it really helps managers become more supportive of what kind of feedback you need in order really to go to that next step. Now, if you have a manager that isn't supportive despite everything that you try, then always make sure that you are making connections with other parts of the organization and other managers who might be more supportive. So this way you'll always have allies should you want to move on from the role that you're in. Okay, so much information. I hope you're finding this helpful. The next thing I want to talk about is your body language. And do you know that your words only convey about 7% of your message, and the rest comes from your body, your tone of voice, and many unconscious things that you may not even be aware of? People respond more to your nonverbal cues, even though it's often subconscious. So think about how you physically approach a conversation. It's important not to startle people. It's been said that men will react more calmly when someone approaches them from the side, since they find immediate face-to-face contact aggressive and confrontational. Whereas women want to see who's coming toward them so that they feel safe when approached from the front. So that's one area about body language. Another is being careful with touch. Now, of course, in these days of social distancing, we don't really have to worry about that. But once we do return to a place, you always have to be careful, because touch from a supervisor can carry a lot of unintended messages messages of dominance. And many people feel uncomfortable when being touched by a supervisor, but often feel uncomfortable calling it out. So it's probably a good practice just to keep your hands to yourself. And be aware of how you're confident you're coming across. So your confidence can be very calming to others. If you tend to fidget or play with your watch during meetings, it's really hard for someone to pay attention to what you're saying. So sit up straight and remain relatively still, showing genuine interest in what's being said. I'm going to share with you a story. A few months ago, I was having dinner with my partner, and we decided to take a walk in town after dinner. And we were passing another restaurant where I saw a tall, distinguished man with white hair, wearing an electric blue colored suit with pink sneakers. And I immediately saw what he was wearing and thought, wow, like that's a very confident person. And then I realized that the person was Bill Clinton. And so, of course, I'd always wanted to meet him. And, so I just, and my partner's like, well, let's just keep walking. Don't bother him. I said, no, I want to meet him. So I walked up to him, and fortunately I did approach from the side because he was actually turned side. I walked up to him and I said, good evening, Mr. Clinton. I'm sorry to interrupt. And I did apologize. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I've always wanted to meet you. So I just wanted to say hello. And I, put out my hand, and he immediately turned to face me. He looked me in the eye, he took my hand, and he said, well, hello, and what's your name? And so the interesting thing about that interaction is that even though it's been many months, I still remember that in that moment when he turned to look at me, I had the feeling that I was the most important person he was talking to. And it reminds me of something Maya Angelou said. She said that many people may not remember what you said, but they will always remember how you made them feel. So think about what your body language says. Make sure that your messages and your gestures are aligned with the message. So if you're, don't smile when the message is serious, because people will think you're lying or they will have trouble trusting you. So think about your body language and how that can impact, and always take the time to make sure that your message is clear. I talked a few moments ago about confidence, and confidence, there's a saying that I like to use, which is fake it until you manifest it. And Dr. Amy Cuddy, who's a researcher at Harvard, actually did quite a bit of gender studies and researched the confidence between men and women. And she actually found, and Google her because her work was really fascinating. She actually found that if you stood up with your feet hip width apart, with your hands on your hips, very much like a superhero pose, that if you stood that way for 2 minutes, that it would have an effect of decreasing your cortisol levels, which is your stress hormones, and increasing testosterone. Testosterone is considered the male hormone, but men and women have, men have estrogen in their body in a lower percentage, and women have testosterone in their body at a lower percentage than men, but they exist. But they showed in these studies that they were actually able to measure an increase in the testosterone hormone, which is associated with confidence. And it really did make a big difference in, they tested different scenarios, like how people performed in job interviews, and things like that. But, again, language is also very important. So when you are in a business meeting, try not to hedge what you're saying. Your confidence will come across much more so if you use statements like, I expect that the outcomes will be higher sales, or my analysis and research demonstrates that, whatever your point is. many women and some, even some men will start out by saying, I think, or I feel. And by using those modifiers, it actually comes across as undermining your credibility. So be careful about that. Don't start out what you're about to say with a preamble of, I know this is probably a dumb question. Well, as you say that, many people in their minds will say, well, if she knows it's a dumb question, why is she asking it? Don't give people a reason to discredit your ideas. If you don't come across that you believe in what you're saying, then no one else will either. Another thing you can do is to avoid unnecessary intensifiers. So saying something like, oh, that report is so bad, try making it really more specific. The report was long and it lacked focus. So it really gives the listener, a sense of what you're trying to say. And be very clear. So this is something that I've actually started doing because, in the past I might have said, and if I'm in a 2-hour meeting halfway through when I'm ready to take a break or, take a bio break or something, I might say, oh, gee, are you tired? Do you need to take a break? So that really left me vulnerable to what someone else's was thinking or feeling. So it's really much more effective to say, we've been going now for an hour. I need a bio break. Can we come back in 5 minutes? And just really, saying it and being very direct about it. Okay, and one other thing that I want to give you is learn to accept praise graciously. A simple thank you will do. Accepting a compliment helps to not only increase your confidence, but also helps the person sending the confidence see that you feel deserving of it. And so that will make them more confident in your abilities. Okay, and one final tip that I want to make here about advocating for yourself. There are so many great men out there who want to partner with you. And so ask someone who's been successful, maybe 2-3 steps jobs above you. Ask them to mentor you. Ask them to help you understand how they overcame obstacles. And ask them the best ways for handling situations or moving through in your career. Being willing and open to accepting feedback really goes a long way to changing the perception people will have of you. Ask for help. It's probably of the 7 things that I've talked about on this slide, it's probably the most important takeaway. Okay, so this final slide, I just want to tie this together and give you some final advice. Number 1, it's not going to be perfect. As I said earlier, when I walked up to Bill Clinton, I did start my introduction with an I'm sorry. It's a habit. And we'll talk about how that really can diminish our own credibility. But here's some really concrete things you can do as you're working on your career. First is find organizations that will welcome you and that encourage diversity. For so many years when I first started in the workplace, women were encouraged to try to fit in, try to do what the men do. And really that was a recipe for disaster. We are very different. We each have great value to bring to the situation. And, today, fortunately, we really know that trying to change ourselves to fit into someone else's view isn't really going to do it. And that there are employers out there that will want a woman to be her true self. So find an organization that welcomes diversity. There is only one you. Recognize that you have unique strengths and that the value that you bring to the table comes when you are willing to express your point of view and to not apologize for that perspective. So, and if you have trouble trying to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, then ask the people who know you best, family members, friends, peers, professors, anyone who's worked with you, because we all have blind spots, and asking others can really give us helpful insights. And that takes us to my favorite, which is stop apologizing. It's a thing, it's a personal pet peeve. I remind myself of it every day, and I'm constantly monitoring my language. We use apologetic language for something as simple as we want to get to the coffee machine where two people are standing. So instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to reach for the coffee," you can say, "Excuse me, I'd like to grab a coffee." And then as they move away, which most people will do, just, thank them. You should apologize, though, if you've done something wrong or something that has really hurt someone. And, if you're at fault, that's okay. But you can also think about reframing, different situations. Like if someone shares with you some difficult news, instead of saying, "I'm sorry," you could try saying, "I hate that you had that experience. That's awful." So, just think about, how you can reframe those conversations, even when you disagree with someone. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry, I disagree," you can say, "I disagree," because you're entitled to your opinion, even if no one else is thinking in the same way. And even like, let's say you've sent out an email and you've made some typographical error that someone expresses, and gives you some feedback on, you can express it in terms of gratitude. Like, "Oh, thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. That's a great catch. I will get it updated immediately." So just be clear and confident in your communication and stop with gratuitous apologies. And always ask for what you want. I always tell my female leaders, if you ask for something and the answer is no, then you are no worse off because you didn't have it before and you don't have it now. So in essence, you've lost nothing. But if the answer is yes, then you're way ahead of the game. So I'm going to leave you with one exercise for you to try. And I hope that you will send me an email for how you're doing and if you tried it. The exercise is called, it's a form of developing confidence by learning how to ask for something every day. And what you'll do is for the next 30 days, I want you to go out, well, you'll have to do it virtually, but once we can finally go outside, and just ask one person for one thing you don't have. For example, like I've gotten on a bus and said, "Can I have a free ride?" Or walked into, a bake shop and said, "I'd like to taste your croissant. Can I have one?" The reason that rejection therapy works is that it helps you to develop thick skin around hearing no. No is just a word. It really has no power but what you give it. So just go out and ask and see how often you'll hear yes. Number one, you'll develop thick skin around the rejection so that it won't feel as bad. The other interesting thing that people have reported to me that has happened is that the value of the ask changes dramatically from day 1 to day 30. I had a student who practiced it, and day 1 really, had a hard time, and eventually kind of kept practicing and kept at it. By day 30, they had the confidence to ask a complete stranger for a job, and guess what? They got it. So, just remember that. I hope that you have found these tips helpful, and I hope that you will practice rejection therapy because it really will help you gain more confidence. I have my email here, and I would love to stay in touch with you. Please reach out and please let me know how you're doing. So now, and here I thought I didn't have a lot to say. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions. And
Hello, everyone. So please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask your question to Professor Lepori, or you can also ask in the chat.
okay, so Alyssa has a question about asking for a raise. Yes, absolutely. You have to ask. First of all, I didn't realize this early on, but you actually have to ask for raises. And the way that you have the conversation is in relation to the value that you've delivered. Always keep it focused on your achievements and accomplishments, and just simply, I always made it a policy that if I didn't get a raise, especially if 2 years had passed, I would also make it a point to, every 2 year, and if I didn't get a raise every year, then by the second year, then I would always go in for a raise. I would, have my bullet points of, what I was achieving in terms of my responsibilities, and also the stretch responsibilities. Because if you're just doing your job, then that's not enough. It's what you took on that was above, maybe in the next, the job level up, and just, give the data. Data is really important. Does that help, Alyssa? And by the way, we can talk. You can unmute your.
Yes, Gina, that was helpful. The reason why I asked the question is because I've been in HR for about 5 years, and I started in nonprofits, which their budget has always been really tight to begin with. And with that tight budget, I've always been devalued and kind of okay with it because I support the mission or what we're doing at work. So it didn't really bother me. Now that I'm more mid-level career and I'm out of the nonprofit sector, I feel like I haven't seen an increase at all or a change. And so that for me has been a struggle in asking for it now that I've been at my company for a year, for example.
Right, right. Well, so yeah, it does require that you do ask it. It's interesting that in the private sector, there's almost the sentiment of if someone's not asking for a raise, it means that they're happy with where they are, and therefore, like as a manager, why would I want to take on a higher budget if I don't have to, and if my people are happy? So it really does put the responsibility on you, but it's really important to have that conversation in a way where you are, demonstrating how your performance has increased the ROI for the organization. So ask.
I think that was the scariest part because now I've had female bosses for my whole life. So a lot of what you were talking about in terms of leadership style, like one of my performance reviews for my first job, my boss was like, maybe you should paint your nails because I was in reception. And that was in 2015. So when you made the comment, I was like, it still happens. And it's females doing it to other females. It's not even from males. So that was one that stood out to me, but now I have a male boss. So the first year with him was so hard because everything I had learned about being a subordinate to a manager was catered to female managers.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't like to check in with me all the time. And I didn't realize how micromanaged I had felt with female bosses until he gave me all of this freedom and was like, as long as you deliver, I'm okay with it. So for me, I struggled for the first couple of months, or I'd check in with him too much. So I'm constantly like, well, did I do this right? Did I do this right? And he's like, I don't understand why you need to check in with me all the time. If you have the resources and you have the tools, just go do it. So for me, I learned the hard way in that first year with him. And now I feel like I've gotten to a point where I feel more confident that I would feel comfortable approaching him for a raise, but I would want to do it the right way, right? Not you know, I've been here for a year, I've did all this, and you should give me a raise. I want to make sure I do it the right way with his mindset.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's why it's really important to understand this difference between men and women. We're not the same. We're wired differently. Our, you know, anatomy and physiology is different. And the more we understand that, the more we can have better communication. And so, you know, so I'm glad that you resonate. You know, I'm sad that someone told you to paint your nails, but you know, it does highlight that women will still get more stylistic feedback. So yeah, and I'm happy to connect with you, Alyssa, if you want to, you know, shoot me an email to give you some advice, because how you have the conversation is going to be very important.
I will do that because I've never done it before in any of my past roles. Even, and you talked about this with your resume when you're applying for jobs, and we want to make sure we hit all of those points.
Yes.
Even when I get an offer, I don't negotiate ever. I don't go back and forth. And I never thought that I could do that until this past role with this boss. He said to me, one of my reviews, he was like, I was surprised that you didn't counter offer because we were prepared that you were going to come back, and we had another, you know, offer to counteract that. And I was like, honestly, I didn't feel like I could. So I learned from his feedback, but nobody has ever told me that, hey, we would have given you more if you had just asked for it.
Yeah.
So that was a piece that if I had only known that, I would have done it. So I'm trying to be proactive about it on the raise end.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it's true. What you say is true. Women will often not negotiate; they'll take it, which is why, in my last job, I negotiated until they finally said, "Look, we've given you everything we possibly can," and you know, like I pushed it to the point where I wasn't going to. I didn't want to lose the opportunity, but I also wanted to make sure that I got everything I could possibly get in that. And, you know, and when they finally said, okay, uncle, I'm like, okay, I'm like, okay, I'm good. Now I'll accept it. But it is a very good point. Women don't negotiate. And, you know, so part of the we earn less, I think, is also our fault, and we have to own that and start opening our mouths and asking. So Ashley's asking, what if you did ask and they know your value but still say no? Well, so that's an interesting question. If you ask, they know your value, but they honestly can't afford it, then it's up to you to figure out whether you stay or start looking for a job where your value is more reflective of what you can offer. One of my favorite teachers had a saying. It was SW, 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 SW. Some will, some won't. So what? Someone's waiting. So even though the answer is no where you are, doesn't mean that there isn't someone who, you know, won't compensate you what is fair and what your value indicates. Does that answer your question, Ashley? I think I don't know if you're talking and on mute. We don't hear you. Does anyone hear her? No. Oh, okay. Her audio is not functioning. Okay, got it. Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we're running a little bit over. I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much for participating, and I hope that you'll take some of these tips and enact them.
Thank you so much, Professor Lepori. I want to thank you for taking the time to work with us on this webinar series. She gave us a lot to think about, everyone. So I'd like to take this time to remind you all to use the resources that are available to you at the Wasserman Center. We do have a weekly series addressing topics concerning COVID-19 in your job search. All of these events are posted on Handshake. We also have our 30-minute virtual coaching appointments available and our virtual drop-in hours from 2 to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. So if you have any questions, please let us know. We want to help you. We also have a few upcoming events here listed. We will also be having a strengths workshop. So Professor Lepori touched on understanding yourself and knowing your strengths. We will be facilitating a workshop on April 29th. So please be on the lookout on Handshake to sign up for that workshop next Tuesday. If anyone does have any questions or concerns, again, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you again to Professor Lepori for taking the time to present on this topic. We do have a survey. If you could complete this, this is helping us as we navigate virtual presentations and virtual workshops. If you could take a few moments, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. We will be sending this recording to everyone, so you'll have it as a resource, and we will also have this posted on our website. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to just close out the meeting. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them offline.